Dear audience, we will begin the event shortly. Please make sure you get your snack box and refreshments, which can be found at the registration desk upon registration. And for those of you who wish to use the lavatory, it can be found on the left-hand side of the exit door outside. Again, please make sure you get your snack box and refreshments, which can be found outside at the registration desk upon registration.
Hello everyone. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University, we'd like to give all of you a warm welcome to today's public reading and lecture by Canadian Governor-General's award-winning Indigenous writer, Mr. Darrel J. McLeod, who's here in Thailand this week for the Nielsen Hayes Bangkok Literature Festival. So Mr. Darrel J. McLeod, welcome to Thailand, and thank you so much for giving us the honor of hosting today's public lecture and reading. But before we begin, may we introduce ourselves. I am Bunyawat Mantanon, third-year English major student.
And I am Thanyamon Sangthong from English major, Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Sanjeev Chaudhary, Chargé d'Affaires, Embassy of Canada, to give his welcome remarks.
Hi everybody. Does anybody here know what a chargé d'affaires is? It's French. If you know what it is, put up your hand. Chargé d'affaires. No, not you, in front, Darrel. Okay, so who put up their hand here? In the first row? Okay, please come up here. Come on up, don't be shy. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to come to you. Come on up here. Come. I'm going to give you a very nice prize, very expensive, if you can tell me what is a chargé d'affaires. But first, you have to introduce yourself, because our illustrious author needs to eat his snack box before he starts to speak, and I'm supposed to kill some time. So introduce yourself first.
Okay, so actually I'll be introducing myself later in another session, but I'll introduce myself now first. My name is Chayin Tenkanokun from the Faculty of Arts International Division. And shall I tell my answer now? Yeah. Sure. Also, Jacques d'affaires is a name of a position known in the business, the industry of the diplomacies, and it refers to the position where it's could I say lower than the actual ambassador? Yeah. Yes. Yes, and
not too much lower.
Yeah, not. I would say that. Yeah, more or less. And basically, he would he or she would represent the country in which he or she comes from. In the case where the ambassador isn't able to do so.
I'd say that's pretty good. I mean, it's not 100%. I'd say it's about 70%, 7 out of 10. But that's good. You're still going to get a prize. Just stay here. Chargé d'affaires. What does chargé mean? In charge. D'affaires, of business. Affaire in French is business. Chargé d'affaires is the person, a man or a woman who's in charge of the embassy when the ambassador is not here. The Canadian ambassador is not in Thailand. We do not have a Canadian ambassador right now because our ambassador on Friday left. She completed her 3-year term. She went 2 weeks ago to say goodbye to the King and Queen. She went to say goodbye to Prime Minister Prayut. I was with her when she said goodbye to Prime Minister Prayut, but not with the King and Queen. And she left the country on Friday, and she is now our ambassador to Jordan. Because she is gone, I am in charge. Chargé d'affaires, because I am the number 2 person at the embassy. So, I am the acting ambassador, but we call it chargé d'affaires. It's a French term. Okay? So when you hear that, it means that it's not the ambassador, a little lower, but not a lot lower. But I'm still going to give you a prize. Now, this is your prize because you had the guts to come up here, and that takes a lot of bravery. This is a special pin. Canada-Thailand pin. Friendship pin. The 2 flags are together, and you are going to get this, and let's give him a nice round of applause. Yes, now please sit down because my speech is next. Okay, so I'm really, really happy to be here at Chula. This is a big honor for me because I have only been in Thailand for 3.5 months. And I will tell you that Chula is a university that I've heard a lot about for many years. Many years ago, I was the Consul General of Canada in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And your university is very famous. I know that the students who go here are very smart and hardworking and are the future leaders of Thailand. So I'm very happy to be here. But there's another reason why I am very happy to be here today. And that is because my Thai language teacher at the embassy is a professor in this faculty. And he is sitting right there. Cree Kiat. Give him a round of applause, everybody. He is the best Thai language teacher in all of Thailand. Number 1. And he is so good that he is now the official Thai language teacher for the Embassy of Canada. All Canadian diplomats who learn Thai learn from him. So I want to apologize to the Dean because we love Cree Kiat very much. And 2 mornings a week, if you are looking for him, please call the Canadian Embassy, because that is where he is, on Mondays and Wednesdays. Now, my teacher has taught me some very nice Thai. And I'm going to tell you what he's taught me, because some of it is very funny, and he is trying hard to teach me. And I am not a very good student, because I don't study. And I don't do any homework. And when he started teaching me, I told him, I am not going to study, and I'm not going to do any homework, because I love Bangkok so much that I spend all of my free time in Siam Paragon. So, I have learned only a few phrases, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what he taught me, okay? So the first thing he taught me is my favorite phrase in Thai. Pom do di mak mak. Okay? Which I say all the time. Chok di. Good luck. Okay? And I'm going to try and say this because I find in Thailand that they use a lot of sugar. There is sugar in everything. Do you agree? Chai mai. Chai kap, you're supposed to say. Chai kap, he taught me. Chai mai. So I don't drink any alcohol, but I love juice. So he taught me this. Now I'm going to try and say it. Remember that I'm a Farang and my accent is terrible. But tell me if you understand this. Ko nam pom lamai noi mai sai nam tam dai mai kap. What did you come up here? You, come on. You're nodding your head up. What did I say?
Can I have a juice, fruit juice, and with less sugar, please?
I bow to my teacher. You're going to get a prize too.
Oh, thank you so much.
And remember,
I'm not Thai.
You what?
I'm not Thai student.
Okay, sit down. No, I'm kidding. You can have this anyway. Where are you from?
China.
China? Oh, okay. She. That means thank you. Okay, everybody. I only have a few more things to say, and then I'm going to hand it over here. So, no more Thai, don't worry. Ajahn Suradet, I practiced that all morning with Cree Kiat so that I would get the pronunciation right. Dr. Kunaya, Dr. Verita, where are you? You were here, there you are right there. And Dr. Tripon, is Dr. Tripon here? No? Anyway, I wanted to say thank you very much for the wonderful invitation to come here to Balak. Like I said, I'm really excited to be here. But I think for the students, what's even more exciting is an opportunity to hear from somebody like Darrel McLeod. And I'm going to be spending a lot of time with Darrel this week. And I have to tell you that it has always been my dream one day to write a book. I admire authors very much. I know how difficult it is to write a book. I have managed in my lifetime only to contribute 2 chapters to 2 different books, but they were textbooks. They were not books like he has written. But I will tell you that to be in the presence of a Canadian author who has won the Governor General's Prize, this is a first for me. I have been all over the world. I have served in India, in Vietnam, in Brazil, Sri Lanka, and now Thailand. I have been with the Prime Minister. I have been with the Governor General many times, but I have never been with an author who has won a Governor General's Prize. So we are in the best university in Thailand, in one of the first faculties at Chula, the Faculty of Arts, one of the first, not the first, but one of the first, and with students who are about to hear from somebody who is a great literary talent in Canada, and I would argue, given the award that he has just won, the world. I will also tell you that we are all anxiously awaiting your next book. So please, tonight, when you go back to your hotel room, keep writing, because we want to buy that next. We're waiting for it to come out. And we're just so happy that you could come here, and very happy to you for hosting him. Dean, thank you for lending us your beautiful space, for partnering with Canada. I know you have visited Canada, and I know that you are lending your staff to the Embassy of Canada. So thank you for all of that. And it's a great honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjeev Chaudhary, Chargé d'Affaires, Embassy of Canada.
So now we'd like to invite Associate Professor Suradet Chod Udompan, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, to give us his welcome remarks.
สวัสดีครับ Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. McLeod, Mr. Chaudhary, Chargé d'Affaires, distinguished guests, students, I am honored to welcome you to this very special event that was made possible with the kind cooperation of the Embassy of Canada and, of course, our guest of honor, Mr. McLeod. Mr. McLeod's story, vividly told through Mamaskatch, gives a glimpse into the complex intersectional negotiations of a life that involves struggles against colonial injustice and trauma, as well as struggles with the question of gender identity. Mr. McLeod's life is one of constant change and transition, from growing up in a Cree-speaking community in the bush to the cities of Calgary, Vancouver, and Ottawa, where I visited 2 years ago, like I said to you before. His story tells of a challenging journey and of those who lent him a hand along the way, from his older sister Debbie to the kind souls he met along the way who have replaced the family members that he had lost. His education included a degree in French language and literature from the University of British Columbia, as well as a diploma in education and a certificate in dispute resolution, something that Thailand is badly needed right now. This varied education launched Mr. McLeod into a unique career path that has given him a wealth of unique experiences. These include the role of chief negotiator of land claims for the Canadian federal government. It might seem odd for a Cree person to be negotiating for the government, but in doing so, Mr. McLeod was able to find common ground between the federal government and communities in what, until that point, had been a difficult negotiation that was going nowhere. Travel, culture, and language are major parts of his life. He had explored the world from one pole to the other, and he is also an accomplished jazz musician, something I didn't know that before. All these experiences from his personal and professional lives have come together to create a deep well of experience from which he could draw upon in the telling of his life story. Here in Thailand, more often than not, the stories of North America tend to be stories of European settlers or so-called terra nullius and empty land, with the stories of indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities being either sanitized or sidelined into a series of sometimes dehumanizing stereotypes. With North America being quite literally on the opposite side of the planet, it is rare that we are given such an opportunity to discuss the life and struggle of a member of one of the First Nations and glimpse into the diversity and uniqueness that exist among the indigenous peoples of North America. The Faculty of Arts of Chulalongkorn University is honored to be able to host the event. And once again, I would like to thank the Embassy of Canada, here we have Mr. Chargé d'Affaires here with us, for their coordination, and Mr. McLeod himself for agreeing to share experiences with us. Thank you very much. ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you so much, Associate Professor Suradet Chod Udompan, Dean of the Faculty of Arts.
And now I would like to invite Associate Professor Suradet Chod Udompan, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, to present a token of appreciation to Mr. Sanjeev Chaudhary, Chargé d'Affaires, Embassy of Canada.
Don't break my gift.
Let me give you some explanation of what we're about to give to you. Is a little brooch, so that you can pin to your necktie or the lapel of your shirt. Or, yeah, it's a symbol of our 100-year anniversary. If you take a look at it, it's kind of part of the tail of the peacock. It's a symbol of our, our Faculty of Arts, because we have Surashwati, which is like the goddess of arts and humanities, and she's riding on a peacock. So we use the peacock as a symbol of that. So thank you very much anyway for giving us the honor of being here and being part of our cultural events here at the Faculty of Arts. So from the bottom of our hearts here, we thank you, the Embassy of Canada, so much. Okay, you're welcome.
And I have something for you, which does not have a 100-year history. It's just been made recently. So here you go. Please open this, because I think I chose it myself for you. Be careful, it can break. Yeah, don't drop it, otherwise I'm going to have to make you a new one. Yeah, please open it now. And I will try and come up with some story as beautiful as the one that you told me. Yeah, be careful. It's two pieces. Yeah, but it does. Oh, be careful. It doesn't. The top comes off, so I don't want it to fall. So this is 100 days old, and it was made for you and sent from Canada. It's the part of the ambassador's gift collection. And as soon as she left on Friday, the first thing I did was go in there and grab a nice gift for you from her gift stock. So this is a box, and you can put your gold inside or whatever you want. And then there's a maple leaf on the front, and there's one on the back. It's two maple leaves, on one on each side. So you can turn it around, and it's never backwards. Okay? So that's the story. And then I also have, Darrel, you should come up with me while I present this, because this, of course, is for you from the embassy, but of course the author himself is here, so I think I should ask you to present it to him on behalf of the embassy for hosting us. Let's hold it, turn that way. Dr. Kunaya, we also have for you. Please come. This is not the gift. This is my gift. This is the gift for you. That's right. It's yeah, no regifting. Darrel, will you join me again, please, while we present this to thank you for hosting us today.
The program also have some gift for you also. I didn't, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to have something in a bigger box. I don't recommend you wear this. It is it's a traditional Thai pottery with the university's emblem on it.
I think this is called Benchamai, right?
Oh, Bencharon.
Bencharon.
Yes.
Sorry. My teacher hasn't taught me the proper way to say it. Bencharon. That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Okay, not on these ones.
So that was the exchange of token of appreciation. Now we shall proceed to the group photo session. So I would like to invite once again Mr. Sanjeev Chaudhary, Chakshar Affair Embassy of Canada, Mr. Darrel J. McLeod, Associate Professor Suradet Chod Udompan, and also the director of the ballot program. Please join us. And also I'd like to invite our distinguished guests to the front of the stage to take the group photo as well.
So now we will begin the lecture and reading session of Mamaskatch, A Cree Coming of Age. Dear audience, please join us in welcoming a very talented writer who also has a lot of other experiences. He is a Canadian Governor General's award-winning Cree writer who wrote Mamaskatch, A Cree Coming of Age.
It is a heart-wrenching book about a Cree boy from Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta, who went through collective trauma and conflicts of poverty, race, gender identity, and bullying. Apart from his successful writing career, Mr. McLeod was a chief negotiator of land claims for federal government, an executive director of education and international affairs with the Assembly of First Nations, and also a very talented jazz musician who sings in the Darrel McLeod Quartet. So everyone, I present to you Mr. Darrel J. McLeod.
Well, I'm just going to get one more. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, series of introductions. So, distinguished dean, distinguished acting ambassador, distinguished faculty, wonderful students, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be in the Kingdom of Thailand, a true honor. And I'd like to thank my gracious hosts from the Embassy of Canada and also the Nelson Hayes Library, who've organized the Literary Festival and really got the ball rolling for all of this process. It's wonderful. And Canada's High Commission, you've worked so hard to make my visit meaningful, pleasant, and beneficial. I also like to thank the university and the dean for the kind invitation to make this presentation tonight. I've had a few days in Bangkok now, and I have to say that I love being here. I love the people. I think my face is getting sore from smiling so much, but it's wonderful to exchange the smiles with you. It's been fascinating. The culture, the spirituality. I'm amazed every morning seeing people praying at the shrines that are all over the city. It's such a wonderful experience, and I've been happy to join in with my Cree chants. And I've mused to my friends that perhaps it's the first time that a Cree chant has been sung at a Buddhist shrine in Thailand. But perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps it's been done before. But if I've set a precedent, then I'm very honored to have been the first. And I hope I'm not the last. I sincerely hope that many of my fellow Nehiawak, that's what we call ourselves, get to visit Thailand and see your wonderful country and experience your hospitality. And I'm pretty sure that for myself it won't be my last visit. It is my first, but I'm 100% sure that it won't be my last. I also did some quick research on the university and learned about its impressive range of faculties, array of faculties, schools, and programs. And I swear that if I were a younger person, I'd be signing up for admission tomorrow to explore some fascinating area of study. I'll begin my presentation with a bit of backstory to contextualize my book, Mamaskatch, so that my presentation and my book itself, should you have the opportunity to read it, will hold more meaning for you. And what I'm going to get into today, I don't mean for it to sound like a litany of grievances, because it isn't. What I'm going to share with you by way of backstory is factual information about the history of Indigenous relations with the Government of Canada in our country. And Canada actually has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has completed its report and made hundreds of recommendations. So the information that I'm sharing with you aren't personal grievances or an axe to grind that I have with the federal government of Canada. But it is important to give you this information by way of context. In one way, at least, I wish Canada's history was more parallel to that of Thailand. As I understand it, Thailand was never colonized by a European power. Canada was, by the British and the French. And this happened at different times in different geographical areas because Canada is such a vast country, geographically speaking. In Eastern Canada, contact and colonization began in the mid to late 1600s and gradually moved further west. The territory I come from, which is now the province of Alberta, wasn't deeply impacted by colonization until the late 1800s. 1899 to be exact. And this was driven by a gold rush in northern Canada, what's become to known as the Yukon gold rush or the Klondike gold rush. And it was primarily, in fact, I think it was exclusively Americans who, in a very random and ruthless way, began to flood into Canada. And there was no way at the time of managing their movement or monitoring or controlling their activities. So gold prospectors simply navigated their way into Canada in a lawless way. Using rivers and streams as transportation corridors, they plundered and pillaged both the land and were violent with Indigenous people who got in their way. There was no rule of law. The government of Canada of the day didn't attempt to assuage this migration because, at the time, Canada was in fact inviting Americans, encouraging Americans to move to Canada to help settle the West, and I say that in quotation marks. So with chaos and crime on the rise, the government decided to make the American prospectors' incursions into Canada more methodical and systematic. To do this, they imposed on my people a contract which they described as a treaty. The treaty, called Treaty 8, one of the many numbered treaties in Canada, involved a surrender of lands and rights with few benefits in exchange. The imposition of Treaty 8 launched a process of colonization and assimilation that was rapid and brutal. Treaty 8, along with parallel legislation called the Gradual Civilization Act, usurped our land and restricted the basic freedoms of my ancestors, freedom of movement. They were obliged to stay on reserves, lands that had been set aside for them, and had to apply for a pass, a day pass, if they wanted to leave the reserve for any reason at all, and could be arrested if they were, and were arrested frequently if they were found to be off of the reserve land without a day pass. Other freedoms that were restricted were freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and the right to use and maintain their language and culture. Spiritual and governance practices were outlawed, and it was illegal for Indigenous people to hire lawyers to defend themselves or advance their rights. Conversely, it was illegal up until the mid-1950s for lawyers to represent Indigenous groups in any action against the state. Children were forcibly removed from their families at the age of 5 or 6 and forced to attend and live in residential schools for at least 10 months of the year. Many of those children never made it back home. Others who did survive ended up spending up to 10 years in those institutions without going home ever. As a result, our society was turned on its head. An entire society, Cree society, my society, and incredible trauma ensued. My book, Mamaskatch, tells the story of how all of this change, all of this disruption impacted one man's life, mine, and that of my family, just 3 or 4 generations into the colonization process. I like the way the nonfiction jury of the Governor General Literary Awards described my book, so I'll read their statement to you. They wrote, Mamaskatch, a Cree coming of age, dares to immerse readers in provocative contemporary issues, including gender fluidity, family violence, and transcultural hybridity. A fast-moving, intimate memoir of dreams and nightmares, lyrical and gritty, raw and vulnerable, told without pity, but with phoenix-like strength. People often ask me where I got the inspiration to write Mamaskatch, and it really came in several waves over a few decades. I think I sound quite old when I start talking in decades instead of years. But it was an inspiration that did come over a number of decades. So the first inspiration was really from a Canadian author who's very well known, and I would encourage you to look up her work if you haven't seen it. Her name is Margaret Lawrence, and she wrote a book, a Canadian classic called The Diviners. And this was the first work of Canadian literature that I studied. because up until that time, most of our curriculum and school work, reading assignments were from American literature, and even our textbooks were imported from the United States. So there was a heavy cultural influence from the United States, and I couldn't relate to any of the families, the characters in, like we had, I'm dating myself for those of you who know this, but we had characters named Dick, Spot, and Jane. And we were stuck with these characters for grades 1, 2, 3, and 4, I think. And they were, of course, white kids from the suburbs of America. And they had a white picket fence and a dog and a cat. And a nice blonde mother and a nice blonde father. And so as an Indigenous child, I just couldn't relate to any of what was, and I thought, we were living on another planet. So I was thrilled to get Margaret Lawrence's book and see the Canadian reality depicted in such an artistic way, in such a rich and vibrant way. And she described the Canadian working class and middle class, and I could relate to that. And I remember her describing her lifestyle through the protagonist. It was a bit autobiographical. And I still remember the opening line to that book, and I'll always remember it. The opening line was, "The river flowed both ways." And it was about a woman author who sat at her kitchen table looking out the window at this magnificent river, and it inspired her to write. And I remember thinking, I was maybe in second year university, and I remember thinking how wonderful it would be to be an author like that someday, and to sit looking outside of a picture window at a river that flows both ways for inspiration. And it turns out that, here I am dating myself again, about 30 years later, I was doing just that. I lived in a little house overlooking what we now call the Salish Sea, or the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And when the tide changes, the water just churns in all directions. It's absolutely wonderful. So a lot of Mamaskatch was written at my kitchen table, looking out at the Salish Sea as the tide shifted and changed. The second wave of inspiration for writing Mamaskatch really came in a second-year French course, of all things. A couple of my French professors became good friends. They were quite a bit older than me, and they became my mentors and almost surrogate parents. And so they used to invite me over to their house quite regularly, and we'd sit sipping French wine and chatting away in French, and they would only speak to me in French. And so it was a wonderful way to become fluent quickly. In any case, after hearing a number of my personal stories and stories about my family, these two French professors said to me, "Darrel, you are telling us a very unique story of Canadiana that only you can tell, and you should write this down someday." And so I just tucked that thought away in the back of my mind and thought, yeah, maybe one day I will do that. And if I can get you to fast forward about 12 years, I was a school principal on a remote Indian reserve in northern British Columbia. And we had hired a wonderful local elder to teach the language. The language of the place was called Carrier, or Duckhealth. And as you can imagine, it was a very remote community, 80 kilometers up a logging road from the closest town. And we had a lot of time to sit around and chat after school. So one evening, after exchanging stories, this elder turned to me. Her name was Catherine Bird, a wonderful woman. She had raised 11 kids on her own because her husband passed away when her children were still quite young. She knew how to hunt moose and to process the moose once she had killed it. And she hunted bear, and she made her own firewood every summer, and that means that she would actually go and cut down trees in the forest and then buck them up, all on her own. She was a remarkable woman, and she was still fluent in her language and a cultural carrier. In any case, after hearing my stories, Catherine one day said to me, and she wagged her big finger in the air at me, "Darrel, you have to write those stories down. They'll help people someday." And it was actually at that moment, that third wave of inspiration, that I knew that I would start writing, that I would write my stories down. And I did start writing my stories. But I thought I was going to be writing stories for children, for elementary level children. And I wrote a series of short stories that I didn't ever show to anybody, and I just tucked them away in a folder. And I was writing poetry at the time, too, that I also tucked away in a writing folder that I still have to this day, just with a simple title, Darrel's Writing. And it was about another 10 years later, this was a long process getting to write Mamaskatch, that I knew I was going to quit working full-time. I had been doing some really difficult work, negotiating land claims on behalf of the federal government of Canada. It was a fascinating and rewarding job that I absolutely loved. And people would ask me how I could do that, being an Indigenous person, how I could work for the government of Canada. And the best answer to that question came from a Maori leader who I met at a conference on Indigenous rights in Canada. And he was a deputy minister in the New Zealand government. And somebody asked him the same question, and he said that the Maori ideal was to infiltrate every level of government that affected their lives and take up a predominant and a key and strong, powerful role in any aspect of government that was going to impact their lives. And when I was interviewed for my job, and this actually comes out in my second book, which I've written, by the way, it's with the publisher, thankfully, and it's just in the editing phases. It'll be out in September of 2020. But when I was interviewed for that job of chief negotiator for the federal government, when I was offered the job, I said to my interviewing committee that when they told me I was a successful candidate, I said, you know I'm going to be working for social change, that I'm working for justice for Indigenous people in Canada. And if you can't handle that, if you don't think that's a good thing, then don't hire me. But they did hire me. And I gave it my best shot and was able to do, I think, make some significant strides for a number of communities and tribes in Canada. But I knew I was going to leave that kind of work. And it occurred to me that this was the time to get back to the writing and to take the writing more seriously. So I took a course at a university in Vancouver, British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, with a remarkable professor named Betsy Warland, who has written books on writing. And she's a phenomenal instructor and a poet and an accomplished author. And she taught a course called Memoir of Inquiry, which sounded to me like a fascinating way of approaching writing a memoir. Rather than taking an autobiographical approach and an episodic approach and recounting that in 1995 this happened and I was here and I did that, you talk about what happened to you and how it impacted that you in the time. So in my case, I would write about what was happening to little Darrel when he was 10 years old, and how did the events, the episodes that happened in Darrel's life when he was 10 years old affect him, and how did they change him, and what kind of a person was he, what was he feeling, thinking after those events happened in his life. And then another layer is to get the writer to reflect on their adult life and how those events impacted them in their current life and impacted the person they are in the present. So I worked through that course with Betsy Warland, and she became a friend and a mentor. And within a year, I had written 26 short stories. And Betsy had done a very gentle edit of them to not modify my voice. The most important thing when you're writing a memoir is to find your voice, an authentic and compelling voice. And I was fortunate to have a mentor that really helped that to happen with me. So after 26 stories, my friend and mentor Betsy said she thought we had the makings of manuscript. And she suggested that I cobble it together in the order that I thought would best work for those 26 short stories. And so I did some research on chronology in literature. And one author and expert in writing I respect a great deal said that if you're going to make a reader jump back and forth in time in chronology in your book, you better have a very good reason for doing it. Because you're asking people to do mental gymnastics. And, most readers don't want to do mental gymnastics. They want to read for pleasure as well as for information. And so I put them in chronological order, more or less. And then my friend Betsy suggested that I needed a bit more depth in my description and in my how I set out scenes, and she even suggested that I could add some dialogue. And so she assigned me to a friend of hers who's a fiction writer named Shana Lambert. And over the course of a year and a half, I worked with Shana Lambert to edit my book, and it went from 500 pages down to the current size, which type double space is about 300 pages. When a publisher goes to print, it shrinks because they put the letters closer together and they use a smaller font. But so I was down to about 300 pages, and a very rich, I think, a very rich text. And Shana, who became another mentor, really felt we were onto something. And so she started recommending me to publishers and to publishing houses and agents. And the rest is sort of history, as they say. Just going to have a quick drink of water, and then I'll actually do a reading from Mamaskatch. So I'm going to read a segment from the last chapter of the book, entitled Beyond the Athabasca. In this chapter, Darrel, his Aunt Rosie, and Uncle Charlie drive Darrel's deceased mother, Bertha, from Edmonton to Smith, 2.5 hours north, because they didn't have money to pay for a funeral home or to transport the body and remain in Smith for 2 days or drive back and forth to accommodate a wake. Mentioned in this passage are Darrel's elder sister, Debbie, and her husband, Rory, who were Darrel's surrogate parents for a few years. Darrel's 4 younger siblings are simply referred to as the kids in this passage. So here we go from Beyond the Athabasca. Panicked jackrabbits did their zigzag hop pattern along or across the road, scarlet blotches and patches of brown fur every few kilometers. Soon, their fur would turn white. I looked in the rearview mirror at the metallic gray coffin, then glanced at Auntie Rosie and Uncle Charlie sitting beside me on the bench seat. I couldn't believe this was happening. I had fantasized about a return to Smith that was filled with triumph, with Mother showing me off and bragging, "This is my son. He went to university. He's a teacher now, Mamaskatch." But instead, I felt humiliation and shame coming on. Tongues would be wagging and clucking. It's Bertha Cardinal, remember her? She's the one who rode through town naked on a bicycle, shouting, "Lady Godiva rides again." And that's her boy. What's his name? He looks healthy. Are those his real teeth? Her oldest girl died mysteriously, and her oldest son, Greg, well, he had an operation to become a girl, took some weird name like Katrina. Heavy gray clouds. The wind had picked up. Was it going to rain? Out of my side window, I caught a glimpse of the ditch. 4 crows settling onto a deer carcass. The speedometer read 110. I lifted my foot. There was no hurry. I turned briefly to Auntie. Who'd have ever thought we'd be doing this? Tap way, she smiled and nodded as she lit another cigarette. The sulfur from the match tickled my nose. I hope Mother doesn't mind riding with us like this. Ma, well, better than in one of them hearses with them weird men in purple suits, Auntie answered. That's for sure. I know she'd rather be with us, I said with a dry chuckle. Uncle Charlie laughed. You guys are crazy. Well, Mother always did see the funny side of things. We passed the sign for Rochester. My grade 9 debating partner, Diane Sasnowski, had lived there. I wondered if she would remember me. Soon we would pass through Athabasca. I loved the rolling hills with a thick cover of spruce trees just before town. So many days I had taken the kids for walks through there and down to the water, to escape. As we watched the muddy river glide by, I glanced about taking, as we watched the muddy river glide by, I fantasized about taking them to a place Rory and Debbie had taken me to once, its source in the Rockies, where the runoff from the Athabasca Glacier fed into an exhilarating turquoise stream in Jasper National Park. I wondered if Mother had ever gone there. Then a torrent of bad memories. The time I had won the public speaking contest at school, but forced the kids to watch Love Story 4 nights in a row to avoid the drunken craziness at home. Oh my God, I had pushed Mother down the stairs there the year Debbie gave me my guitar. And the spring day I abandoned the kids, I had cried on the Greyhound all the way to Calgary. I wanted this trip to be over so I could get on with my life, my beautiful life on the West Coast. Athabasca, Island Lake, Hondu, then Smith. 2 nights there. That's all I could take. Then a day in Edmonton, then home, back to Vancouver. I fixed my gaze on the road and I thought about L'étranger, the novel by Albert Camus that had shaken me in my second-year French course. The book's opening sentence was, Aujourd'hui, maman est morte. Today, Mother is dead. Would I be like Meursault, the main character? He didn't cry at his mother's wake, and he went out partying the next day. The only thing that made sense to him in the whole experience was that nothing made sense. He didn't relate to any of it, the religious rites and doctrine, the staged mourning, the ceremony and burial. I hadn't empathized with his character when I first read the novel, but now, with each passing hour, I did. The luminescent green sign warned us that the Smith turnoff was 30 kilometers ahead. In 45 minutes, we would be there. Auntie turned to look at me. Who the hell would do this? Who would drive their mother's coffin around in a cargo van? What would they say, all my relations and the white folks in Smith? Geez, can't even afford a hearse, or is he too cheap? And to think, his mother bragged about him being a teacher in Vancouver. I sighed and then mumbled, well, I guess things could be worse. Oh yeah? What you mean? Uncle Charlie took the bait. I read a story in school about an American family who had to take their mother's body halfway across their county in a horse-drawn wagon to bury her in her hometown. Took them 9 days, and they almost lost the coffin twice. Once while fording a river, and then again in a barn fire. And to think, they were broke. No money for embalming, no ice, and no refrigeration. You can imagine the stench. Wow, be awful, eh, Darrel? I guess we're lucky, only a couple hours drive. Ma, is that where you got the idea? Auntie smiled. The random stands of spruce trees around the picturesque cemetery confirmed it. We were entering Smith. Clusters of children with dark skin moved off the street to let us through. Cousins for sure, even though they wouldn't know me. The cloud cover was thick, but I knew it wasn't going to rain. Another whirlpool of memories. The Francis General Store, now called something else. Shopping with Mother for frozen hamburger and canned peas. Leonard, the LaFrance son, Smith's Prince Charming, never spoke a word to her and would shoo us kids away after we had spent our nickels and dimes on candy. The 3-story Smith Hotel Cafe, Jack Ma, Mother's friend and former boss. She used to chuckle when recounting how she teased him about his calling out of the menu each day with his Chinese accent, Mustamitalos beef ham bone steak. Or at the Dominion Day Fair, peanut, popcorn, quack-a-jack-a jelly apple. And how he, in turn, kidded her about her English pronunciation and mimicked her awkwardness when serving tea and pie to the who's who of Smith. The night I ran to get Mother out of the bar because Uncle Andy was bothering Debbie. The interminable seconds it had taken for the bartender to come to the door after I rang the buzzer. We drove by the small wooden church, now painted blue with a simple white steeple. Mother had loved the original Gothic-style church, but it had burned to the ground the year after Greggy was assaulted there. I still recalled Mother's terrified voice yelling, "The church is on fire," at 5 in the morning, followed by a resounding clang when the huge bell hit the ground. She and Ned had speculated over coffee what a bad omen the fire was for Smith. Did the church burn because of Father Jal, I had wondered at the time, his foul mouth and bad behavior? Mother had hated him. "Coco, such a pig," she would say. "He went with my sister-in-law and then bothered me after your dad died." Tomorrow we would go to the church. Tomorrow there would be a proper green hearse for Mother's coffin. Tomorrow, at this time, it would all be over. Well, almost over. First the church, then the graveyard, then what? The longest night of my life. Or would that be tonight at the wake? The stage was set. People had done this before. The furniture had been cleared away from the living room, and the sheer curtains were tied back to reveal the long, dark wooden coffee table on which Mother's coffin would be placed. Rows of stackable plastic chairs were set up facing it. Cushions for kneeling sat in a straight line on the floor. Candles of different shapes and sizes flickered all around. How eerily familiar the scene felt. It was just like in L'Étranger. Uncle Charlie directed how the coffin should be placed. Odd music in the background, not the usual country music of Johnny Cash or Loretta Lynn. When I recognized the da-da-da-da-da-da-da of habanera from the opera Carmen, I was sure I had become delusional. The women were busy in the kitchen preparing sandwiches and coffee for the wake. The men, my cousins and uncles, were watching TV in the extra bedroom, their eyes glued to the screen. I sat with them. It wasn't an illusion. The chorus had rallied around a voluptuous Carmen as she sang, "L'amour est un oiseau rebelle que nul ne peut apprivoiser." I loved that line and remembered translating it from Milan, my good friend. Love is a defiant bird that cannot be tamed. Thank you so much. Since the publication of Mamaskatch, amazing things have been happening. It's almost like Twilight Zone moments at times, surreal things. So I'll start with one of the recent ones that you can relate to. I had the US launch of my book in Minneapolis at the end of June of this year. And I read that same passage at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon to a large group of people. And that night, you'll recall that I was talking about a drive through Athabasca and mentioned my debating partner, Diane Sasnowski, and I wondered if she would remember me. Well, I got back to my hotel room around 9 o'clock that evening and opened my emails, and there was an email from Diane Sasnowski, whom I hadn't heard from since grade 9, since I was 13 years old. Somebody had passed her my book and suggested that she read it. And you know, we reconnected like we had never been apart. She was a true friend. And we exchanged emails probably twice a day for the first few days. And we're still in touch. Turns out she didn't have an easy life either. And she's now a visual artist, an amazing painter. And I'll visit her when I go back to that part of the country next summer. A similar kind of story happened with a girl, and she was a girl at the time. I mentioned in the chapter called One Little Indian Boy, which takes place when little Darrel is in grade 1. And little Darrel has a crush on this girl named Cindy, and he thinks she's like a fairy princess. She's blonde. All the fairy princesses in literature at that time were blonde and fair, right? And so there was this blonde girl with blue eyes and a lovely complexion, and she was a very nice girl. And she and Darrel had a bit of competition going because they were always the top 2 in the class. In those days, I hope teachers in Thailand don't do this, but in those days, teachers weren't very kind. They would hand out the test results in order of highest achieving to lowest marks. And so you always knew who was at the top, and I was always at the top, and Cindy was always right after me. And so we had this little competitiveness going. But Cindy could never talk to me. She could never socialize with me because she was from the richest family in our little town, and I was from the poorest family, literally on the other side of the tracks. And she was white and I was indigenous. And so I'd run up to her on the playground at recess and try and chat her up and be friendly with her and hope to play with her and talk. But she couldn't respond. And we were in grades 1, 2, 3, and 4 together. And then when I was 9, I moved away because my family fell apart. Cindy moved away because her family sold their business. So we hadn't seen or spoken to each other since we were each 9 years old. Well, one day I was checking my cell phone. I was out somewhere with some friends and I saw an email flash across my screen with the word Cindy Stelter. And I thought somebody was writing me about my book and about a character in my book. So then I thought, well, wait a minute, I better check that. It was Cindy Stelter. She had written to me, she found me. And a similar type of thing happened. Somebody recommended my book to her. And the coolest thing about this reunion was that we became friends on Facebook, of course, and we started writing each other. But in her first message to me, she sent me a photograph. And it was a photo of the grade 2 school picture I had given to her. And I'd written on the back, to Cindy Stelter from Darrel McLeod. She had hung on to that photo for about 50 years. And she said she thought about me from time to time. And then she said, "Are you still allergic to Brazil nuts?" And I was really curious. I thought, what is she talking about? And then I remembered. We were at a school assembly at one Christmas. And in Canada, especially in small communities and poor communities, they hand out little brown paper bags with candies and oranges and nuts in them at Christmas time. And so we were sitting in the school gymnasium watching some movie about Christmas. And it was a beautiful movie with this family having a typical happy American Christmas. The kids were all happy and getting great gifts. And I was crying because our home was starting to fall apart. And the movie made me sad. And Cindy tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around, and my eyes were all puffy and red, and she asked me what was wrong. And I said, "I'm allergic to Brazil nuts." And she remembered that all those years later. So that was one type of reconciliation that happened with those two friends from my school-age days. And I'm still in touch with both of them. And we write each other and are very supportive of each other all the time. But that these two kids from two different realities could come together decades later and find a bridge of commonality. And it turns out that one of Cindy's daughters married a Cree man, and so her children are now part Cree. And she's learning the language. She's intrigued by the culture and the language. It's just wonderful. It's amazing how things happen. But for me, perhaps the most important reconciliation was with my own family. So my book came out in Canada on, I think, September 13th of 2018, last year. Well, a few days later, I get a dramatic message on Facebook from one of my cousins. It's actually the daughter of one of my first cousins. And in our culture, your cousins are like your sisters and brothers. I don't know if it's like that for you folks, but your first cousins are really like your sisters and brothers, and you grow up with them and you're raised with them as if you're siblings. So one of my first cousin's daughters, who was about 30 at the time, heard about my book that had just been published, and she went into their in this little town, they have a one-room library, and they have a librarian that works maybe half a day a month. But she found the librarian, and she said to this librarian, "My cousin just wrote a book. I need it. I want it now." And Cree people can be very stubborn, and you don't usually argue with them. And so the librarian brought it in for her, and literally within 2 days. And 3 days later, my cousin had read the book, and she made this dramatic Facebook post that this book could be telling the story of my life, This book is helping me to heal, and this book will heal our family if we let it. So that was just wonderful to me, to get that kind of validation from a young person, a younger person, from a Cree woman, a cousin. And then about a month later, when I was nominated for the Governor General's Award, I got a phone call from two of my oldest cousins who are about 76. And so they're now the matriarchs of the family. And they said to me that they wanted me to come home because they wanted, to our little village, they wanted to organize a feast to celebrate my book. And it turns out our family hasn't had a feast to celebrate anything for decades. We get together for funerals, sad occasions. But they organized a feast, and so I flew from Vancouver to Edmonton and drove to my small town on the Thanksgiving weekend of 2018. And 50 of my cousins gathered in a hall and made a feast of wild moose meat, deer stew. They made bannock, which is our bread now, and they baked pies with wild blueberries that they had picked the summer before. And we had a love-in for 4 hours. It was absolutely amazing. And there was this energy in the room, unity in our family that we hadn't felt for a long time. And I tell you that because before our family was disrupted, all of us, my uncles, aunts, grandparents, all lived together in our own little community with no electricity and no running water. We lived off the land in northern Alberta. And guess what? My grandparents all lived to be in their 80s and 90s. My great-grandfather, who I mentioned in my book, Moshom Powder, lived to be 85. And he was out on the trap line until 2 weeks before he had died, on his own. He would go away for a week at a time, and he was in the bush up until 2 weeks before he died. My great-grandmother, my kokom, on the other side of the family, lived to be 95. So I knew both of these great-grandparents, and they only spoke Cree. They didn't speak any English. But fast forward a couple of generations, we've been displaced from our community. We were forcefully relocated because oil and gas was discovered. This is just south of the Athabasca tar sands, rich with oil and gas. And now our beautiful territory is crisscrossed with pipelines, compressor stations, and dotted with pump jacks. And our family is disrupted. So it was a big deal for us to reunite and get together and have a celebration like that. But there are a couple of other amazing stories of reconciliation that I want to tell you about quickly. Just after my book came out, the Vancouver Sun published a review of the book, and they titled the review, Mamaskatch, A Roadmap to Reconciliation. And I love that title. I was very honored and flattered. I didn't write the book with reconciliation in mind. That's a big picture piece that I hadn't contemplated. But it's wonderful that it began to happen. So with that theme in mind, one day, just remember that theme, one day I got a call from a reporter who's now an independent reporter. He used to work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And he's now an independent journalist. He has his own blog, his own media process. His name is Rick Harp, and he's based in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in the center, kind of the center of Canada. And he phoned me and said he wanted to come to Victoria to interview me. Actually, to the little town where I live. I live in a place called Souk. And I thought that was a bit strange, that when he could just do a telephone interview, that he wanted to travel all the way out to see me. But I said, sure, I'll make time. So he said, there's only one catch. I want to bring my mother. And she's an 82-year-old fluent Cree speaker and a survivor of the Indian residential school system. And I became worried. I mean, I was thrilled on the one hand, but on the other hand, I was worried, afraid that she was going to scold me for the way I used Cree in the book, because I didn't run the Cree language sections by any academics or Cree language experts. I deliberately did that because I wanted the Cree in my book to reflect the state of my language to this day, the way it is with me. And so I was sure that I was in trouble. But the elder had come, this beautiful 82-year-old woman, had come to thank me for writing the book and for using a Cree title and for including Cree passages in the book, untranslated. She had never seen that before, and it meant so much to her. And she wanted to thank me for some healing that the book had helped her to realize. She was a survivor of an Indian residential school, and she had been through some of the experiences, some of the horrific experiences that I describe in the chapter Hail Mary, Full of Grace of my book. And for about 7 decades, she'd been carrying around a burden of guilt about what had happened to her in the residential school. And in my book, I write about a time when I was a school teacher in Vancouver, and the Vancouver School Board brought in a specialist in sexual abuse prevention for children. And this woman was absolutely amazing. She was a nurse psychologist. And she described to the class, who were only 9 or 10 years old, what comprises sexual abuse. And she described to them in very clear terms and very raw terms. And then she said to the children, if any of you are experiencing this, you need to talk to an adult that you trust. And the most important thing she said to them, I thought, was she said, and no, you need to be aware that if this has happened to you, it's not your fault. And so that was the line that the elder had glommed onto, that she had captured, that had so much meaning for her. Because for all those years, she thought that what she had experienced was her fault. So as you can imagine, the 3 of us had a little crying session in their hotel room, and then it was 11. It was just absolutely wonderful. So I was very blessed to have this Cree elder validate my book. And when you get the book, you'll see there are some blurbs in it, some validations from other authors. And there was one blurb, the first one I got was from a man who identifies as being Cree or Nehiao and two-spirited. And he's a brilliant young man. He's, I think, 29 or 30. And he's already an associate professor of creative writing at the University of Calgary. He's working on his PhD. His name is Joshua Whitehead. And he wrote this prosaic blurb that literally had me in tears. It was what he wrote that had me in tears, what he said, but it was also the fact that this young man who was identified as being two-spirited was validating my book and validating me as a Cree man. It was absolutely wonderful. It was one of the most meaningful moments I've had since the book has come out. So there's just been no end to the experiences. I could go on and on talking about the types of reconciliation. But there's one really sweet story that I'll tell you, and I'll leave you with that. I was nominated as well, and I was a finalist for another prize in Canada, a prestigious prize called the Royal Bank of Canada Charles Taylor Prize. And so I went to Toronto, and they really do it in style. They put us in a big fancy hotel for 5 days, the 5 finalists, and they wine you and dine you. It's just great. But they make you work too. And one of the things they made us do was to speak at a Sunday brunch where there were about 250 people who had each paid $50 to come and hear us. So there was some pressure to be good and to perform and to do a quality speech. In any case, I did my speech, and we had a book signing afterwards in the hallway, and luckily I was the last one signing books. I was quite pleased that there was a lineup. And everybody had left. I didn't see anybody in the foyer of the hotel, and I was just packing up my things to leave, and this petite woman walked up to the table, and I looked up, and she was wearing a fur coat, and she said to me, "Would you mind signing my book?" And I said, "Of course, I'd love to sign your book." And in my speech, I had acknowledged the elders in the crowd, because in my culture, elders are very important. We respect our elders for what they contribute to our society, for their wisdom and their guidance. She said to me, "I want to thank you for what you said about elders. It was very meaningful to me." And she was a Caucasian woman. She wasn't Indigenous. She had bright, lively blue eyes and gray hair. And so I said to her, "Well, how old are you?" And she said, "I'm 105. It's just beautiful. And so I said, "Can I give you a hug?" And she said, "I'd love a hug." But here it was Toronto, a winter day in Toronto, and this 105-year-old woman had come to a literary event, to a book reading on her own, and wanted me to sign her book. It was just wonderful. It was another precious moment. And over the last year, I've been traveling around Canada. I've been to almost every major city in Canada except for Saskatoon, Regina, and Halifax. I've been to all the other major centers. And I've been traveling in the United States as well, and had so many rich experiences like that. And I'll just close by saying, I'll do a full circle and close by saying how amazing it is to be here with you. And it was a true blessing to talk to a few students before the session as well. So with that, I guess we'll move on to the next phase of our evening's events. Hi, hi, Aichikasiam.